Hi, everyone. Just to echo everything Dr. Cook said, you all are in for a treat. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sierra, and I will be assisting and moderating the chat. So if you need any assistance during the presentation, please send me a direct message. So quickly, let's go over our Zoom housekeeping. The session will be recorded, and the recording will be sent out to every registered guest as well as posted on our website, but you'll get a link tomorrow from me. We ask that you mute yourself during the presentation, but utilize the chat to engage throughout. Give Dr. Bright feedback and talk to us and talk to each other so we can keep these conversations going. There will be a time where you will be encouraged to unmute yourself and ask questions. So save those questions, write them down, and keep them so you can ask Dr. Bright your questions. Let's get into the good stuff, y'all. I'm so excited. Dr. Kawanna Bright is an assistant professor of library and information science at East Carolina University. Dr. Bright has a doctorate in research methods and statistics from the University of Denver, a master of library and information science from the University of Washington. She teaches courses on research methodology, leadership and management in libraries, academic librarianship, collection development, and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Her research focuses on assessment in libraries, EDI in libraries, applying research methodology to library and information science, and the liaison librarianship role in academic libraries. Like I said, you all are in for a treat, so let's all welcome Dr. Bright.
Thank you so much, Sierra, for that warm welcome and for reading that entire bio, which is a little bit much sometimes. And a really big thank you to Dr. Cook. I was so honored to be invited to be a part of these important conversations. And I'll do my best to make sure that I continue the theme that's been going on of fantastic speakers sharing really important information. So let me get my slides going because, of course, I'm still a librarian and I have slides to share with you all. All right. Let me know if everyone's seeing slides. Someone give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Thank you so much. So I titled this, "What's It All Worth?" Because to be honest with you, the process of engaging in work, in DEI work, or IDIA work, or whatever you want to actually term it, it's a lot more involved than a lot of people realize once you start doing it. Whether you got into it intentionally or like me, you just started doing it and you realize the necessity of doing it. But there's this need to have a conversation about why we do this work and why it's so important, and also why others should be engaged in this work as well, why it's not just the work of the few who are in the field and sort of seeing the issues and concerns that we have. So what I'm hoping to talk to you today about, of course, is my DI work, why I continue doing it, and then specific talk a little bit about an activity that I developed in collaboration with a librarian in a public library called the Privilege Layer Cake Professional Development Activity. And then at the end, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of trying to dismantle systemic inequities through research, and really more about where I am in that part of my process, that part of my work, and what I think I am doing well and what I think I need to work on, and where I think I need help from a lot of other fantastic people in the field as well. So when I talk about my DI work, I tend to think about it on three levels. I think about my consultations that I do, the workshops and presentations similar to what I'm doing right now, and then my curriculum and teaching. I do a lot of consultations, mostly for academic libraries, but also for public libraries, anyone who essentially reaches out and requests assistance with DEI work. So when I'm working specifically with academic libraries, I do a lot of assessments that are based on this audit that I've been spending quite a few years developing with the help of a lot of fantastic people, including Nakat Gauss, who is an academic librarian who specializes in organizational design and development. But this process of using this audit, which was supposed to be a self-assessment audit. And when people ask me about the name, I'm like, well, it was designed to be something that worked by itself for academic libraries to use. And what we've learned is that it doesn't do as good of a job by itself because academic libraries are not these similar entities that exist and everyone looks at them and they're exactly the same, right? We recognize this. I've worked in 4 academic libraries. They were all so different and in many ways also much the same with some of the issues and concerns they had. But this process of going through these audits and really trying to help academic libraries break down the issues and concerns they have with equity, diversity, inclusion, and then build them back up. And that's sort of the process of why I do consultations. But sometimes my consultations are simply about talking about how do you create an action plan for DEI, or how do you integrate DEI into your strategic planning, which is actually the more important process. And then also just if you need help with assessing any part of your organization. So I had one organization that wanted to look at their policies for DEI, and we did that. We created a rubric. We went through the process of what am I looking for? What am I really trying to dig out and parse out from this process? And we spent a lot of time just talking about how the organization could do a better job of integrating that throughout. But a lot of what I'm really focused on with these consultations is improvement of the field. But I think we can all recognize that sometimes that doesn't necessarily work as well one-on-one as an individual trying to do that work. And as one person, it's very difficult for me to do a consultation with more than one library at a time. I do still have a full-time job as a professor, and I do teach classes, and I do research and service and all those other things. So trying to work with just one library and have this idea that it's really going to change the world or change libraries, even I know that that's a bit of a pipe dream, but it's part of the process of what I do. I think I spend most of my time doing workshops and presentations, and we actually counted during COVID, during the pandemic when we were all at home and able to spend a lot more time in these presentations than normal because they were virtual. I did 51 presentations on DEI topics in the space of a year and a half. And a lot of these presentations were focused on things like how do we cultivate these anti-racist, anti-bias hiring practices or workplaces. We have this idea of what we want, but how do we get there? So I spent a lot of time talking about that. Spent a lot of time talking simply about privilege and equity in libraries and the fact that we think about it for our communities, but we tend not to think about it internally in terms of who we are as employees and those who are actually doing the work. And then also, yes, continuing this process of how do we serve our diverse populations? How do we make sure that we're paying attention to their needs and not actually projecting what we think their needs are onto them based off of really old information about communities that was probably collected by someone who wasn't actually in the community and probably not for that community to begin with. And then just the idea of cultural competence and cultural humility. That final one is not one of my main areas. It's something I'm just now really trying to fully integrate into my work. We have a lot of great people in the field and quite a few in this room right now who do some fantastic work on cultural competence and cultural humility. And I know for a fact that we've probably, I think it's a book coming out soon where we're actually looking for a little more information on that as well. Now, the final area of my work is curriculum and teaching. And in many ways, I see this as where I am able to have a bit more of an impact and a little bit more widespread impact, because I do focus on how do I make sure that I am preparing my students to do this work, to make sure that they're going into the field and carrying along this message of the importance of DEI. Now, of course, we have a Services to Diverse Populations course at ECU. It is one course, it is an elective, and typically we're lucky if we get 10 students who are able to take it because they just don't have room in their curriculum to add another course. But for me, the more important aspect of it is the integration of DEI into the other courses I teach. I will tell anyone who asks me that there is no course being taught in LIS that cannot have DEI integrated into it. And I will argue anyone to the ground who tells me that I'm wrong. And I will typically also be able to show them how they can integrate DEI into their course if they simply take the time to ask that question. So specifically for me, of course, I'm teaching administration and management, very easy to integrate that in there. Research methods, of course, absolutely, I'm integrating it there. Collection development, another easy area. And I'm pretty sure my students in my academic libraries class this semester are tired of me talking about the importance of DEI in academic libraries. So kind of threaded throughout the course. In some cases, I'm doing an individual module, right? Sometimes I'm like, it's an entire module on what this really looks like. But for the most part, it's an attempt to make sure I'm fully integrating this throughout the actual course. I especially want to do a call out to Dr. Cook. The Services to Diverse Populations course, as it was originally created at my program, wasn't really looking at anything other than outreach and program development. And Dr. Monica Colon Aguirre, who's now at USC, actually started making changes to that right away when she had a chance to in that course. And then once it was passed on to me, one of the things that we both did in collaboration was also look at what Dr. Cook was suggesting that we should be doing in terms of how do we build a course like this? How do we create something like this? And I'm happy to say that that course now has a lot of those elements in it. And I think the students are getting so much more out of it. It's so much more beneficial and it's more widespread than it was beforehand. Now, of course, buried within all of this, of course, is my research. And so I do, of course, consider my consultations to be research. They are very much research. And I will argue about the evaluation assessment as research another time. But I think it's really important that I see it as research, that I see the collaborations with libraries as opportunities to improve this audit, and that I'm also thinking about how others can benefit from it as well, the dissemination of that information. And definitely with my workshops and presentations, we're talking about making sure that what's being shared and presented is very much focused and based on the research, what we definitely know, where people have spent time and interest trying to understand and provide answers, and sharing that information more widely. And of course, within my curriculum and teaching, I'm trying to figure out how to do even a better job of looking at my curriculum and teaching, not just the research methods course, but all my courses in terms of how I can then make sure my students are learning what I'm hoping they're learning, follow up with them after a few years. Are you able to apply this in your libraries? How did it go? What does it look like now for you? Are you sharing that with your colleagues? And that to me is also important information, and something that I'm working on, doing a better job of following up with my students as well. Now, I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about my DEI consultations because, and you'll notice that my little faces here are actually showing that some of them are kind of sad. I think it's important that we talk about what I'm trying to accomplish there and why this work needs more people involved. But for me, the goal is to really try to help these libraries identify where they're at in terms of their efforts towards DEI. So where are you putting your money? Where are you putting your people? Where are you putting your resources? And then also, how can we make improvements, and how do we make sound improvements, and how do you make sure you're making decisions that are based on data that's been collected and not just the gut reactions that we often have. But as I mentioned before, what I do there is very much limited. It's localized impact. It's for that library. And that's important for them, absolutely important for them. But it's not as beneficial for the field as it can be. It's not as beneficial for others. It's not as widespread. Now, I've been lucky enough the last, I guess, year and a half to be working within one system. I've had almost all the libraries in that system wanting their own consultation. And I'm seeing now that they're actually getting together. They're sharing their final reports. They're talking about different ways they can collaborate on this work so they can make improvements within the system. And that's been a bonus for me because that was unexpected at the time, but a wonderful opportunity for them, and also a wonderful opportunity for me to see how they're able to then take this information and turn it into something useful. But the piece of this I really want to talk about is the emotional labor that is buried within this process. And so as a consultant, I'm an external to these systems. I usually don't know anyone who works there, despite the fact that I know so many of you all in the field. And I spend time talking about the importance of everyone being involved in the process of doing an audit. So when someone signs up with me to do an audit for their library, it's an entire organization audit. And I'm asking everyone in the organization to be a part of finding the information, collecting the data, and then trying to figure out what the next steps are. Well, some of you aren't going to be surprised when I say that that doesn't always go over very well. We have people in our libraries, we have people in our organizations who truly do not feel that DEI is important, that it is part of their work at all, and that they need to change anything about the way they approach their work. And sometimes those people are in positions of power. And sometimes those people are in positions where they can actually, make or break whether or not changes are made in that organization. And so you're bringing in an external consultant and you're asking that person to do this work, and then immediately facing a brick wall for that consultant. So that's one of the things that I spend a lot of time on for the pre-work for the audit is getting over the hurdle of people not wanting to engage in the process, not even wanting to engage with the conversation. And then even if we get past that, there's always going to be people who just aren't going to be as fully engaged or engaged as positively as they can be. I've had instances of sabotage within an audit process where someone specifically tried to sabotage the process because they just weren't interested in finding out the information that was going to be found. I've had incidents of people trying to bully within a focus group meeting, and having to deal with that as well. All those things happen, and all those things come back to me as the consultant as emotional labor, because I'm having to then manage not only the audit process, but I'm also managing this organization and what's going on there. But the other more important piece of this is recognition that we've got many people working in our libraries who are considered to be underrepresented, marginalized, what I usually like to call traditionally excluded populations. And they're often alone and dealing with all these situations, all these things happening in the organization by themselves. And as part of my process of doing consultations, I do offer one-on-one conversations that are not recorded, that I don't take notes from, that are just opportunities to have conversations. And essentially those turn into sessions where we counsel, where we talk. We just make sure people have a chance to finally have an ear of a person who doesn't tell them they're imagining things, that they're being too emotional, that they're misreading the situation, that they're lying. I mean, all these things that have happened to many of us who identify as people of color or marginalized for other parts of our identities. And that is a level of emotional labor that I actually never anticipated when I started doing consultations. But it's also probably one of the most important pieces of the work that I do. And I want to continue emphasizing that because oftentimes we're also talking to the people and about the people who are doing the work in our libraries. And they also need assistance and support throughout that process. So I'm going to talk about other stuff that's going to be a little bit more sunshiny, but I want to make sure I emphasize that sometimes this work isn't as pretty as I would even like it to be, and that it actually is a strain and it's very difficult. But I continue doing this work because even when I have those conversations, even when I have those barriers and those walls, at the end of the whole process, I see an organization that now has a path. I see an organization that now has concrete answers and suggestions and possible solutions to problems that may have been holding them back. And I see the possibility for them making improvements in that organization that are going to make improvements for those people who are struggling within the organization. And so despite all the things that can happen, despite sometimes the struggles, I will continue doing this work. I will continue taking on the additional emotional labor that goes along with it because of the value that I know it's going to bring to that organization and in turn to the people who are in that organization. All right, so on to the slightly sunnier things, and we're going to talk a little bit about food. So I apologize if you have not had anything to eat yet, because you were probably not expecting anyone to start talking about cake in the middle of a session. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about this process of building what we call the privileged layer cake professional development activity. But before I start that, some questions for you. I want you to think about this idea of privilege, and you can think about it from any context you want to, but I want you to think about what privileges you might have been born with, which privileges you might have earned throughout your lifetime, what privileges you may have lost or even regained, but lost throughout your lifetime. And then the final two things I want you to ask yourself is, would I give up my privilege? And notice here, I'm not telling you which privilege to give up, if you could give up one, but if you could give up certain privileges, would you give up those privileges? But even more important, can you actually give up privilege? And so I want you to kind of think about those questions just for a minute. This is not a pop quiz. I'm not going to make you actually report on that. Feel free though to share some thoughts in the chat if you'd like to about that. But this is going to be center for understanding why this whole professional development activity was even developed in the first place and why it's important that we actually have these conversations. So development of this crazy idea actually started when I was working at the University of Denver. I was a new faculty member, just trying to figure out which end was up. And I was asked to teach LIS 4700, which was called Privilege and Equity in Libraries. And to be honest with you, I was a little hesitant to teach this class because I was at the University of Denver, which is a private institution, and I had spent all my time there earning my PhD. So I knew that there were issues with privilege and equity in the organization as well, but also this innate sense that I had no idea what privilege was. So how can I teach anybody else what privilege is? Or I don't have privilege. I have no privilege. How do I teach someone else about that? But here I am teaching this class, and I spent a lot of time with my students just having discussions, just in-class discussions, getting them to engage in conversations about these topics. And we finally got to the whole class discussion about privilege. And the questions I posed you were essentially the questions that I posed to my students. It was just a casual conversation. You know, what privileges do you have? Where did you get them from? And then if you could give them up, would you give them up? Now, for that class in particular, it really was a question of white privilege because they actually were asked to read 2 books on white privilege for that class in particular, which of course is very relevant to a field that is predominantly white. And so that's what our field actually is. But asking those students, you know, would you give up that privilege? And then challenging them to explain to me if they even could give up that privilege. And so really engaging in that conversation and realizing that they really were stuck, and so was I, on this idea of privilege being a have and have not type of conversation, rather than being something a little more nuanced. Well, from that till June, where I've moved across country, I'm back in the South. I'm learning how to be an academic person here at a different location. And I was asked to keynote the Colorado Association of Libraries, the summer conference, the Power and Privilege at Play, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Library Conference. Part of the reason I was asked to keynote, of course, is because I had worked at the University of Denver and the people who were planning knew me. So normally they wouldn't have found me hiding over here in Greenville, North Carolina. But during that keynote, I made a passing reference to the class discussion. It was just a passing reference. I told essentially the same story I told you about how I was trying to engage my students with this conversation, trying to get them to understand that privilege is more nuanced than we think. And out of that, I get an email about a week later from Joanna Rendon, who was working as the director of young adult services at Pikes Peak, and also apparently was a part-time instructor at Denver, which I didn't know at the time. But she asked me if she could try out the activity on her staff. And I remember my first response was, what activity? This was a conversation. But she actually detailed out for me what she had heard, which essentially was an opportunity to have an engaged conversation, but in a structured way. And so, of course, I had no problem with this. I thought it was a great idea and did ask her to follow up with me to let me know how it went, because she just wanted to do something with her small group of staff and maybe get more connection with them since she's, their supervisor and just wants to maybe connect better with those who are working with her. So I get a follow-up email from her saying that it went fantastically well, and so well that she had shared the information with the Colorado Association of Libraries about doing a learning event. So the next thing I know, we're collaborating to create this really formalized activity that's going to be run by us for the Colorado Association of Libraries. And how do we expand that out from Joanna's little group to a group of 100 people, and really trying to better understand how to get more and more people engaged in that conversation. And even from that, it went on to collaborating with someone who was in that session, Christine Krieger, who wanted to do the activity for the Colorado State Library. And so it started to snowball from there, really. I never anticipated what started out as a class conversation to turn into an activity where people were truly having these really strong conversations about not only what privilege was for them, but what it meant for them in their library. And that was the piece that I thought was most important for these conversations. And also for me, because every time I've hosted this session since then, every time I've done this session, I hear something different every time, because privilege is not just the black and white issue that people often think it is and what we often see in the news and what we talk about. There's so much more going on there, especially when we think about privilege in libraries, that we need to be aware of and the impact that that has on how we structure our libraries. Um, I actually now have information because Joanna has helped me to develop handouts, instructions, including timing for those who are interested in doing a professional development activity. And so anyone who's interested in trying this out on groups big and small are free to download all that information from our website. It is freely available. I'm always happy for people to do that. One thing I am working on is creating an evaluation for that activity, because I would love to collect some information on the further impact, like asking Joanna to follow up with her staff on what that's meant for their organization after they've had that conversation back in 2020 during the COVID times. Now, before I do move on, though, I do have to stop and segue, because the one thing I probably didn't tell you is why a layer cake. A lot of people ask me, why is it called the privileged layer cake activity? I am a stressed baker, and people who know me know this. They get cookies in the mail from me because I bake when I'm stressed, and I'm often stressed. Uh, so when I was teaching at the University of Denver, I actually taught in person, and my students were treated with something every week, whether it be cookies, scones, whatever I happened to make that week, or whatever they requested sometimes, which I was happy to be challenged in the baking aspects of my life. But I was actually working on just a cake, a regular cake at the time, when I was actually trying to plan out how to talk to them about privilege. And it hit me as I was making my own cake that I was thinking about privilege as if it were a black and white issue, that I was thinking about as a have or have not issue, and that even I wasn't really thinking about privilege in a more detailed, nuanced way. And I was just kind of joking with myself, and I was like, it's really like a layer cake, right? You have multiple layers of privilege, or it could be a tiered cake if you want to think about it more like the bridal style or something like that. But it's more of this idea that you could have layers of privilege that are layered on top of each other, which can actually strengthen things or give you more privilege in some ways, and that it is possible to lose layers of your cake or layers of your privilege. And it's not the best way to think about privilege. It's definitely not the only way to think about privilege. I've actually seen many other analogies that even I think are more visually appealing, or at least more logical for some people to grasp. But this made sense to me as someone who likes to bake and also someone who likes to eat cake. And to be honest, when I was first talking about it with my students, they got cake that day. So it kind of made sense that they actually got some cake when we were talking about privilege. And I mentioned to them, and in that keynote, that privilege was like a layer cake. But this is why, in case people were wondering, why there's a privileged layer cake activity, and and why that's something that I thought was logical to share with people. All right, so now for the hard part for me, something that's difficult for me to talk about, but I think is also very important. This idea of how we dismantle systemic inequities through research. As a research methodologist, something I never thought I'd call myself. When I entered this field, I was a librarian. I became an academic librarian. I was instructional services. I did start doing assessment stuff because of instruction. Most of us usually get into assessment that way, but I didn't see myself as a researcher. I was not really a strong researcher, didn't understand research methodology, never saw myself becoming a research methodologist. But once that became the possibility, I kept thinking about how can I use this knowledge? How can I use what I know to do bigger work? How can I have more impact? How can I cause more damage to a system that is inequitable? And I had a lot of big dreams when I first graduated with my degree a few years ago, and I still have some of those dreams, but I have to acknowledge that there is a distinction or a difference between my dreams and the actuality of what I'm able to do. So my dream is that I'm spending time conducting research that really exposes these inequities and then provides concrete solutions for how to remediate these issues in our libraries. And I think that's still a solid dream, but I think that there was a little naivety even in me in terms of my ability to do that on the tenure track system as a new faculty member. So all those things that I didn't necessarily consider when I was thinking about how I'm going to take over the world with my PhD, and do all this great work in libraries, the things that I felt I couldn't do just as an academic librarian, the things I felt I didn't have the knowledge or the power or the insight to do, is what that dream became. And for me, the actuality is that I do conduct research that continues to highlight the inequities that exist. So we know about them. They exist, they're out there. And I'm doing research that highlights that they're still there, that they're still in place. I do provide suggestions for remediation. A lot of what I do for my consultations is suggestions for how to fix it on a small scale. But I struggle to find publishing avenues for my results, wide-scale publishing avenues for my results, or at least avenues that will be seen by those who need to see it. This push for tenure, and I like to always put this out there, means that I'm looking for, of course, publishing in all the peer-reviewed journals that are being read by certain people who may or may not be the ones who need to be reading my work, and it's definitely not the entirety of our field. And I'm also, of course, focused mostly on academic libraries. So what's happening in our public libraries, what's happening in our school libraries, our special libraries that still also need some of this attention, quite a bit of this attention as well. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, if I'm not at my dream level and if this is the actuality of it, am I missing out on something? Am I failing in this process? And I had to get past that idea that I was failing, because it's not failure. It's that I had to change the idea of how to reach the ultimate dream. And that means that I'm finding myself kind of somewhere in the in between. And that's how I consider where I am now. I'm spending a lot of time focusing on this idea that I can prepare the next generation of librarians through teaching them inclusive research practices in particular, but also in all the other classes, to do this work, to do DEI work, to make it such an ingrained part of who they are that it's natural for them to go into their new settings, or if it's their current settings, because a lot of our students are already working in libraries, to speak up, to say something in meetings, to volunteer and propose projects that will actually help to remediate some of these issues. Because one of the biggest issues and concerns we have in our field that I see is the perpetuation of the problems we have. These inequities are just continuing to be repeated and repeated and repeated, and nothing's happening to break that apart, to stop it from happening. And having it change in one organization, in one institution, is great. It's fantastic, especially for those in that institution. But we know how many libraries are out there, right? We know how many people are still stuck in these systems that are not changing. And we also know that a lot of times new librarians are being asked to join these organizations, and then they're being indoctrinated into the same system that perpetuates the same inequities that were already in place, rather than being taught how to break the cycle. And so part of what I'm trying to focus on is helping my students get a little bit upset in some cases, get a little bit on their soapbox about it. I have one student in particular who I still love getting her emails because she started trying to implement stuff she was learning in class, particularly about DEI. She was really upset that they weren't willing to change their collection development policy to address the inequities they had in their collections. And she was dealing with an administrator who just was like, "You're not doing it, right? We're not doing this. We don't need to do this. We're fine. Our community doesn't need this." She was so upset that she fired off like the longest email I've ever received about how she couldn't believe they wouldn't listen to her because she has all this knowledge and she wants to apply it. And while I was upset on her behalf, of course, because I wanted this to work for her, I wanted her to be able to show up at this meeting and be able to say, "Hey, we need to fix this," and then have people say, "Yes, we need to fix it." But I was also just beyond ecstatic that she got it, right? And that not only did she get it, she was actually thinking about other avenues to get her point across. She wasn't ready to give up. And to me, that was the more important piece. She wasn't ready to say, "Well, they wouldn't listen to me, so I'm just going to say, fine, we're going to do it your way." She says, "No, no, I'm going to figure out a way to get this done. I don't know how, but I'm going to figure out a way to get this done." And that's what I'm really trying to do. That's where my in between is right now, is getting students to have that level of fire and passion about this to the point where they want to change things and that they're not ready to take no for an answer. And yes, utilizing those consultations that I'm doing because of the evaluation that's built into them to make small changes because they still have the potential for big impact, especially in the systems that I have been working with since somehow, some way, I've been collaborating within larger library systems and being able to see them work together so that they can then make larger impact. I'm actually really hopeful that in the next year or so that I'll be able to do more of a train the evaluator process for anyone who might be interested in learning how to administer the DASA instrument and be able to then apply it to their own institutions, organizations, or even to another library that might be within their system who's interested in having someone come in and do that work as well. So if that's something you might be interested in, please reach out to Dr. Bright because I'm very much interested in finding people who might want to engage in some of that work, but just haven't had the opportunity to get some of the training or just want to know more about how you might possibly start doing that type of work as well. And then, of course, opportunities like this, opportunities that Dr. Cook is offering for me to be verbal and outspoken during my workshops and presentations about the importance of all of us doing this work. And I kind of see this as my way of planting seeds with you all. Just like I plant seeds with my students to watch some of this sense of ownership of the importance of DEI grow within everyone else. My sense of ownership didn't come because I wanted it to come. It came because out of necessity. I had to do this work for myself and for my colleagues and for others as well. And I kind of want everyone else to feel that same sense of necessity that we all need to be doing this work, even beyond the sense of creating the occasional ally, right? We all need to be doing this work, not just as allies, but as those who are fully engaged in making change in our organizations and making change in our libraries. Because of course, we keep telling people how important we are, and we are, but we on the back end are perpetuating a different view outward to the people, that they think that we're all roses and rainbows and unicorns, and we know we're not. And there are plenty of people in this field doing some fantastic work on things like low morale. Katrina doing that work. I mean, that's what needs to be out there. We need to start recognizing that it's not this pretty fluffy place that we like it to be, but that we can change that. And so hopefully, even though I feel like I'm in the in-between now, I'm very hopeful that I'll continue moving towards more of that dream that I have, and that I'm okay with the actuality because I am still making progress, and I'm hopeful that other people will join me in what I consider to be one of the most important fights that we have in this field. Maybe not one of the most important fights in the world. There's so many other things that we're trying to work on right now in this world, but at least in our field, one of the most important things that we can continue fighting for. And so that's way more talking than I probably needed to do today, but probably not as much as I wanted to do. But I'm really more interested in questions. I would love to engage some conversation with everyone. So I'm hopeful that you've all been chatting and hopefully dropping questions in there for Sierra to throw at me. And I'll go ahead and also flash my huge thank you now. And also, if anyone's looking for me, Dr. Kawanna B is the best way to find me, at gmail.com. And of course, I have a website. I'm on Twitter too, but I tend not to post that.
Okay, that,
Right.
oh,
Go ahead, Sierra. You
no,
got it.
we have a few questions. I wanted to make sure I pulled them. Tiana asked, okay, hold on, it dropped my page.
Oh, no.
Hold on. No, it's right here. Tiana asks, when you work with these organizations, do you say participation is mandatory? It seems like mandatory often comes with pushback.
We actually avoid using that term on purpose, because if the minute you use the M word, you just lost anyone who was on the fence, and you definitely lost anyone who was already on the other side of the fence saying, I'm not doing this. No, we spend a lot of time crafting messages that really talk about things like the importance of having the opportunity to have your voice heard in this process, right? Especially for people who have spent a time saying that they're not being listened to, which is often the case. They're not being listened to, they're not being heard. So the message is often, this is your chance to have your voice be heard in this process, to make sure that you let us know where this work is taking place and whether or not you've been allowed to be involved in it, whether or not you've been allowed to have conversations about the work in the library. And then we also spend a little time reminding them that as a consultant, I can't surface these problems if you don't talk to me, right? So you can't later on, when you see the report, say that, well, you didn't talk about X, Y, or Z. I'm like, well, I couldn't talk about X, Y, or Z because you didn't share X, Y, or Z with me. And so I do sort of give that little caveat when I talk to them, that if you don't tell me, I can't then put it in the report. And if it's not in the report, then that's just another reason why they can claim not to address it, because obviously it's not a problem if it's not in the report. So yeah, we do not use mandatory. We spend a lot of times using just encouraging language. Please participate. And also, it's why I offer so many different options for engaging with me. So when people are completing that audit instrument I talk about, I want them to complete it as a group because it's better as a group. You need to have the conversations. One person cannot tell you every single thing happening, especially in a large library. But some people aren't comfortable in those group settings. Most of us librarians aren't comfortable in group settings. And so we also allow them to do that as individuals. And then we have the focus groups, but we definitely know focus groups don't work for everyone, especially if you are stuck in a focus group with someone who has been your bully, or the person who's kind of been going after you for an extended period of time. So I offer those one-on-one conversations. And so a lot of times that flexibility helps to get over a lot of the barriers that some people have. And the mandatory, or the sense that you have to participate, we try to keep that out of the language as much as we can.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Tawana asks, what are your self-care practices? You talked about emotional labor. How do you process it?
Well, those of you who follow me on Facebook know that I don't have good self-care practices. I am horrible. Okay, Dr. Cook, you don't have to shake your head, but you're right. But no, I used to have really good self-care practices. I used to go for runs if I was feeling really, really, stressed and needed to do things. Even the baking, the stress baking was very good for me and really good for my colleagues too. The pandemic kind of didn't help with that, because guess where the baking stayed? Yeah, and that wasn't necessarily good for me to have all that sugary stuff in the house with me at the time. I used to knit as well. That was the other thing I used to do for my self-care, was giving myself time to knit. I am now requiring myself to start adding these things back into my schedule. I've already given myself the last part of December off and told everyone to not talk to me, and I will not be responding to emails or other messages. You've got to do that. I've also started putting blocks on my calendar that are quiet times on my calendar. So I don't care if you want to meet with me during that time. I'm not available during that time. You're going to have to find another time to meet with me. And then making myself do little things like go outside, enjoy the wind, look at the leaves fall, complain about having to go do the yard work. I mean, little things like that, but things that are just not related to the work. Like, you have to have that. It needs to be a clean break. It has to be a clean and solid break. And I knew this in the past, and I allowed myself to get away from that. And that's the danger of this game. It is a bit of a game. It's a dangerous game that I'm playing, where I'm trying to work towards tenure and do all this other stuff, and doing a little bit too much. So I have already vowed to myself, and I'm lucky that I have a mother who is really good at reminding me when I say things that I'm going to do, and she will not let me forget. And so we've already decided that even starting in January, I'm limiting the number of presentations I'm doing next year. You know, once I hit a certain point, I don't care what you're offering me. I can't do that presentation. If you're willing to wait a year, great. If not, I can point you towards a lot of fantastic people who also cover these topics, who are also looking for opportunities to share that information. I'm also building in a vacation. I have a really good friend who's going to try to spend their 50th birthday somewhere exotic. And I've already said, I don't care what the cost is, I'm coming with you. So these are the things that you have to do. You have to find those things and then build that time in to do that. I've already promised a couple of people some knitting things that's going to help, because if I know someone needs it, I have to do it. But I have to give myself those things that are not related to this work, because it's not even just burnout at this point. It's flame out at this point. And so, yeah, guard yourself, guard your emotional health, because it will turn into a physical health issue, which is what I've been dealing with. And I don't want anyone else to ever experience that. So great question, Kawanna, because you know me. So yes, that was a setup question, but it was a good one.
Okay, I don't know, I apologize if I say your name wrong. Manisha, as is perpetuating happening because of colonization and neo-colonization, bureaucracy, systems, and structures.
I would say a lot of it, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's part of what we talk about, things being built in, right? And so if you build anything on a structure that's been around for 200, 300 years, and is comfortable for the majority of people in that system, then there's no push to change it, right? Like, why would you change it? So, and also the problem we have with people acknowledging those systems and the negativity of those systems. They don't even want to acknowledge that, you know, the whole colonial issue. Like, we don't want to acknowledge that, oh, it exists and it's still there. The fact that we're still having conversations about why people don't want to acknowledge that the majority of our institutions, especially on the East Coast, were built by slaves, or the enslaved, I should say. The fact that that's so hard to acknowledge, the fact that we're still arguing about what we're teaching in our schools because we don't want to talk about it. So I would say absolutely that part of the problem we have is that you've got something that's so entrenched, it's in the bones. It's absolutely in the bones. And we're talking about ripping the bones out. That's painful and it's hurtful. And people are more worried about what they think they're going to lose than about the benefits they would receive if they actually just recognize that we're all humans and we need to work together with this process. And I will say that, especially, I need to say this about academic libraries, especially, I can't talk about public and school because I haven't worked in those, but in academic libraries, there is a problem with people being more concerned about themselves and less concerned about what they're doing, the work they're doing, right? And what they should be doing in those organizations. And they're willing to hurt other people to maintain their status and to maintain their privilege. And I think that's something we have to acknowledge, that the reason we still have these inequities, the reason we still have this systemic inertia that's happening is because people are willing to hurt other people to maintain what they have. And we have to be able to get past that.
Beautiful. Okay. Okay, Lisa asks, do you allow for anonymous feedback? They are really struggling with the pros and cons of this in this area.
Actually, when I do the consultations, those who complete the audit individually are anonymous. They are granted the anonymity to participate that way because sometimes that's the only way I can get them to participate. And so, yes, for the evaluations, I do allow that because I want the information. And as a person who's doing the data analysis, I still get a lot out of what they share, right? Even if they don't have to tell me their name, they don't have to tell me their department, they just have to tell me the information. And I still get so much from that. That usually tells me a slightly different story than the groupthink story that I'm often getting when people get together and have those conversations. And so I do allow for anonymous feedback and anonymous information to be submitted as the evaluation process. I also, in my classes, allow my students, when I have midterm evaluations, I allow them to have anonymous feedback as well. They don't have to tell me who they are. They can if there's something they want me to follow up with in particular to them and their grades, but they don't have to. They can just give me information, give me feedback, and I usually try my best to make sure that I'm implementing that information. I want to point out that also, especially when I was teaching the privilege and equity course, I do this work and I believe in this work, but even I still make mistakes, right? In my teaching and in my word use. And I had one student who left me some anonymous feedback because they felt I hadn't properly addressed a situation in the class where someone had said something and they expected me to respond in a different way. And I realized that their interpretation and my interpretation were two completely different things. But their interpretation was valid, just like my interpretation was valid. But the fact that I'd given them the opportunity to give me anonymous feedback meant that I got to see that, and I learned from it. I learned how to respond better, or at least recognize that I might need to respond differently in my class. And if I hadn't done that, I don't think the student would have given me that feedback. I think they would have been concerned that they were criticizing me as a professor and that I would have taken it the wrong way. So I definitely allow anonymous feedback through all avenues of the work I do, because I do still see value there. And yeah, you get the occasional feedback that's just not constructive. You take that with a grain of salt, and you move on from that as well. Because my mom always says that that's just means that I hit a nerve, and that what I said was really important. And so keep doing what I'm doing. And so I always take those and see those as positive as well.
Beautiful. Another question for you. Have you used the privilege layer cake with the privilege walk, or are there two different recipes?
I've never used it with the privilege walk. I actually don't know what the privilege walk is, so I'll have to do some. Oh, and yeah, Dr. Cook, was that a hand up?
No,
Okay.
I was clapping for your last remark,
Oh,
but
okay, perfect. No,
but just really quickly, for those who don't know the privilege walk, I've seen it done virtually, but it's really a physical exercise,
Mhm.
and you have people stand in a line,
Oh,
and you're asked a series of questions,
and
and
more.
if you can, yeah, either move forward or backwards,
Yeah.
and then at the end, you talk about why there are so many gaps.
Okay, so I was thinking, I used to call that the privilege run, because the example I saw was the person where the kids were running.
Yeah, yes,
So same thing.
exactly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Yeah, actually, no, and someone actually did ask me about that last week, about the possibility of combining those two things together. And I was intrigued by it as well. I was intrigued by the idea of being able to have people physically stand up and ask some of those similar questions, but then also engage them in that conversation, those questions that I asked. So I actually like that idea. I like the idea of seeing how those two things might go together. So it's a great suggestion. I'll have to dig into that a little bit more.
Okay, that's the final question I pulled from the chat. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Cook, who might have some additional ones for you.
Yeah, thank you, Sierra. And please, we have at least 10 minutes. So if you have additional questions, please put them in the chat, and we will get them to Dr. Bright. I wanted to ask you, you said that you had done 51 sessions during the pandemic. Yeah, I agree. The pandemic was off the chain in terms of it was busier than ever in not traveling, right?
Yep.
I wanted to know, you may know or you may not know, are people still working with what you shared with them?
I would
Are they implementing,
Are
I
they
should say?
implementing things?
Yeah.
I do hear from the occasional library or group that I've worked with. I try to reach out usually once a year.
Mhm.
Especially if I did a true workshop, if I
Mhm.
spent, 3 hours with them, to ask them, so how are things going? How did that conversation go? I had one in particular where it was a group that they're not libraries. They work with libraries, and they wanted to talk about doing audits. They got together and decided to take the DASA and try to create something for their type of organization with it. And so I've been checking with them. They added me to their Google Drive doc so I could add some insights and information, and then came up with a version that they want me to, I'm going to add to my website for those who are interested as well. So to me, that was an example of that one stuck, right? Like that truly stuck in their head. And those are the ones that I'm really hopeful for. I think a lot of the others were still more surface than even I wanted them to be. They were reaction to the deaths, they were reaction to the riots, they were reactions to a little bit of everything that was going on during that time. And I think people were trying to apply band-aids to the gaping wounds that we had, and that they applied their band-aids and that
Yeah.
they moved on from there. But I do know, because I'm nosy, that a couple of the libraries, I went to go look to see if they had started, they were working on strategic planning at the time. And I went to go look at their strategic plans because I was curious to see if they had made any changes. And in some cases, it was just one goal or one small objective. But for them, that was like going from the earth to the moon,
Mm.
because they'd had nothing in the past. So I really wish I wish I could say I had a whole list on my whiteboard here of all the libraries that followed through big time and did the work. But I'll be honest with you, for the most part, I don't think they did more than just that session.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then that was about it.
Yeah. So with follow up to that, are they coming back? to you for additional workshops, right? Do they need another Band-Aid?
Do they need another Band-Aid? I haven't heard from anyone who I did a session for in the past for additional Band-Aids, but I've started working with certain groups who want me to do continuous workshops. So
Okay.
more of the sessions, like I've been doing a series of workshops for Metro up in the New York area, and not all DEI stuff, because I'm going to include DEI anyway.
Right.
So even if it's not labeled that way, but that's been exciting because it's like forming a long-term relationship and knowing that they are truly doing and they're doing that work anyway. Metro's doing fantastic work. They just started that new program. They have a scholarship program trying to support some library school students who are doing this work or hope to do this work. So I'm happy to be a part of that process with them as well. But I really haven't had a lot of follow-up from anyone saying, hey, you're going to come do another session. Part of it could be that I've also raised my rates.
Listen,
yeah, when you first start out doing this work, you're just happy to do the work. And then after that, you start factoring in the emotional labor and realize that you need to be paid for that too. So yeah. So I think some of it is they know that they probably can't afford at least what they paid the last time probably wouldn't be the same fee. So yeah.
You raised another important point that I wanted to follow up on. So you mentioned that you do a lot of series, right? And this idea of building the rapport, building that relationship that you need to actually get folks involved in this work. So for yourself or for any of us that are limited to the one shot, if you will,
how do you do that?
How do we do that? Any tips or just how to not be in our own feelings when we can't get as much as we would like done? Because the one shot deal they're really hard. They
are, especially the lack of feedback afterwards, the lack of anything to show the impact that you hope that you had. I think for me, it's, well, for one thing, I'm trying to find better ways to evaluate that type of work. That's something that I can share with others as well, because I think we need that, something that's a little more structured, where it's almost like you're guaranteed to get some type of feedback so that you have something concrete to at least use for the next time you do a different session for a different group on the same topic. And then you're still building. So I think in that way, creating your own series. So maybe it's not a series in terms of the same group of people, but maybe it's you're still using that topic, you're sharing information, but you're building it, you're making changes, and you're growing. So that would be one of the things I would suggest. The other thing is, and I know this is hard to do, but once you do start building those relationships with people, you can go back to them and say that, I would love to do another session for you on this related topic at this particular, at your next session or your next thing, but sort of plant that seed yourself rather than waiting on them, because that's one thing that I've been thinking about for some of the smaller sessions I did, because there were topics that I wanted to talk about, but I only have 50 minutes. And I kept thinking, we really need to do like a 2-part, 3-part, 4-part series. So starting to go ahead and feel like you have the agency to say that when you're also talking to people, which all of us who started out doing instruction with faculty, we know we were just happy they wanted us. So so you didn't bother trying to say, can I have more time? No, you just like, thank you, I'll take my 10 minutes or 15 minutes. But once I was able to establish myself at the institution and spend more time, I would start saying things like, you know what, I really need 2 sessions with your students. Like, I cannot do this at the time. I can give you an intro, but then we're going to do another session later in the semester, because I felt I had built that agency. I think that's the other thing we need to work on is going ahead and establishing we have that agency now. So if someone's coming to you and they want you to talk about this topic, you get to say, you know what, I like where you're going, but I need 3 sessions. And this is how they need to be divided up, so that you already build that into the process. And I know that's hard. Don't get me wrong. Like I said, when I first started doing this work, I was like, oh, you love me. Yes. I'll do whatever you want. And now it's more of, let's have a meeting. Let's have a conversation. That doesn't work for me, but this does work for me. And for the most part, I've never had anyone say that doesn't work for us. They're fine. They're absolutely fine. They just don't expect you to do it. So yeah, taking that agency to build that in.
Great advice. Thank you. So we have a question from Catherine. Catherine says, we have a very, very small library staff. Do you feel like librarians will be completely honest during the audit process when they might have their actual opinions out in the open based upon the process of elimination?
Right.
So, sorry if I mangled that, but yeah.
But actually, no, it's a solid question. And the thing I probably didn't quite make clear about the DASA is that it's actually not about the individual person's experiences. It's about the organization's work. And so what it's asking you about is whether or not the organization is doing this work. And yes, you can provide examples of how one person or department is an example of how that work is being done, but it doesn't tend to call out anyone by name or rank or anything else. It's just are you doing this work, and where's your evidence that you're doing this work? That has helped a lot with smaller groups that do this because of, yes, that concern. It's not a climate assessment. And we all know what I'm talking about. That climate assessment where the first thing they do is hit you with the questions about, have you experienced microaggressions? Have you experienced this and this and this? And you're like, yes, and you're answering, you get to the end, demographic questions. And you're like, I'm the only one. I'm not answering that question. And then you don't submit it. And so the DASA is not built that way. It is an organizational assessment instrument that is meant to not pull out that individual piece, which is why I do have so many one-on-one conversations that are more emotional in nature, where people just want to get that out. Sometimes the results of the DASA is you need to do a climate assessment, but you need to do it in a safe way. But that's not part of what that is. So yeah, we don't usually have any issues with that instrument because it's not designed to collect that type of information.
Got it. Yeah, I just refuse the climate survey for that very reason. We have one more question. This is from Joe. So Joe says, hi, Dr. Bright. I recently watched ACERL's Why I Left the Profession, DEI Perspectives. Many stories were heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Do you meet many who have left librarianship due to DEI issues? Do you think that that's lessening? Also, how can allies, for example, white males, fight against the systemic inertia that you mentioned?
Yeah. So that's a three-parter. So do I know many librarians who've left because of diversity issues? Absolutely. I know more than I want to, more than I can count on hands and feet right now. And specifically because of the racism and the bias. And a lot of that was seen in inability to be promoted. And if you can't move up, then why are you staying at that organization? And you often see a lot of us moving around a lot because we're trying to find those opportunities to move up or trying to find a situation that's a little bit more protective. Do I think it's getting better? No. Unfortunately. However, strangely enough, many of us were protected by COVID. And I know that sounds weird, but not being in the office, not being in the place where people were allowed to treat us that way gave us this sense of relief because we didn't have to face it every day. I hate to say that even in my position, I was dealing with this along with one of my colleagues who's now at USC. We're not going to mention. we're dealing with this. We got relief, which is sad to say, from COVID because we didn't have to deal with it every day, which meant that few of us probably stuck around longer than people thought we would because we had that break. And why so many are fighting about the going back to campus full time so much, because they don't understand we're not fighting just because they think it's flexible. I want my office set up. It's so much better than what I have at home, right? My back, everything else. I don't want everything else that came with it, though. I would rather deal with my back hurting and sitting on my couch and having bad backgrounds than to go back to what I had before. And that's that same sensation. And then what was that third part? If you can hit me with that again, Dr.
How can white males or allies help with the systemic inertia?
First and foremost, keep your ears open and be willing to speak up when you hear other people instigating the microaggressions, saying things they should not say, bullying in the workplace, and make sure you're not one of the ones who's doing it by accident. And that's what being okay with acknowledging that you may have microaggressed somebody. I've microaggressed somebody before and I apologized for it because I realized after the fact that I did it, but not everybody's willing to admit that. But you need to also be willing to make sure that you're making space for those librarians and for the staff members to speak up, that if you hear other people talking over them or using their ideas or taking their agency, that you stop that process in the tracks and say, actually, I think X, Y, and Z was trying to speak at this time. You're going to get tired. You're going to be surprised. You're going to get tired the number of times you have to interject, the number of times you have to tell someone else that you shouldn't have done that, or we need to have a conversation about that, because it's going to happen when you start noticing. The first time, it's going to be like a rolling stone down a hill, and it's going to keep happening. So being verbal about it and acknowledging your own role in it as well, which may have been something in the past, working on yourself, but getting others to work as well. And just making sure that you also, not necessarily create opportunities, but guard the same opportunities. Make sure that everyone has the same access that they're supposed to have to promotions, and that it's not being maneuvered or taken away from them by someone else. Those are little things you can do. I could probably give you a list, a list longer than you want, of things that you would want to look out for and things you would want to do. But it's mostly just starting to be present and hearing and listening and being willing to speak up, and not just, by the way, on an email later on or in their office later on.
Mhm.
I've always, hey, I appreciate you coming to my office and telling me that. Why didn't you say it in the meeting? Because right now, this right here isn't helping me, right? And try not, they're like, well, you're being ungrateful. No, I'm not being ungrateful. I'm letting you know that you're not supporting me the way you think you are. And being okay with hearing that, and then doing a better job the next time.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that is a perfect way for us to conclude today with some really concrete, actionable items. And I think, to your point a little bit earlier, I think it's worth reminding and noting that this happens at all levels, right? So it happens to your professors too. So yeah, lots of work for all of us to do. So please join me in thanking Dr. Bright. This was an amazing conversation. We were so grateful to have you spend some time with us today. And thanks to everyone in the audience for coming out and spending some time with us. Next week is our last critical conversations for the season, if you will. And we will be joined by Angel Truesdale. So we hope that you will join us next week for our finale of the season. But, the bar is really high now after Dr. Bright. So thank you all so much. And thank you, Dr. Bright.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cook. Pleasure to be here.
All right. Everyone, enjoy your day, enjoy your week, and be well.